Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically about Kazan Yamaoka, better known as the Oni. Today we'll be talking about, why his lore is, in my opinion, the best in Dead by Daylight, and the turning point that Kazan's lore marked in the game's approach to storytelling. But first, I want to explain why I'm covering Kazan's lore now of all times. I know I touched on Kazan before in my Family Matters video alongside his descendant Rin Yamaoka, but I feel like I wanted to make a dedicated video about him and why I think his lore is so good. And I wanted to make it now for a very specific reason. Because the king in the castle may soon be dethroned. Just because Kazan's lore is the best in Dead by Daylight so far, doesn't mean it does everything perfectly, and as a result, the next best characters are hot on his heels. In particular, Sally Smithson, better known as the Nurse, and Adiris, better known as the Plague, both do their actual in-depth character work incredibly well, I'd say, better even than Kazan. The Nurse has already been confirmed to be the killer in Tome 6 Divergence, that should be going live to the main game at about the same time as this video gets uploaded. It will take a few weeks for Sally's full story from this archive tome to be revealed, but once it is, there is a very serious risk that she takes Kazan's crown at the top of the lore food chain. And even if she doesn't, DBD Leaks has apparently data-mined that Adiris will take a starring role in Tome 7. And when she does, oh, I'm gonna have fun with that one. So much fun. But those aren't out yet, and as such, for the time being, Kazan Yamaoka stands proud as the best lore in Dead by Daylight, for one very simple reason. That reason is context, and how well his lore balances Kazan's internal thoughts and feelings with his external world. Kazan's lore has blazed a trail for future killer lore to follow, and sets the benchmark that all killer stories should aspire to, a standard so high it has yet to be surpassed. And it all comes together so well because no part is at the expense of another. The historical context, Kazan's family and his own character all work together in perfect tandem to tell the story of the Oni as completely as possible. So let's start with the historical context behind Kazan Yamaoka. It's not made explicitly clear around what date Kazan Yamaoka was active in Japan.
What year is it?
But clues from his descendant Rin Yamaoka can help us out here. His great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter attended Takamatsu University, a real-life Japanese university founded in 1996. Assuming she was about 20 at the time she attended, and given the university was probably around for a few years before she did, that means she's probably born in the early 80s. If we're working with an average generation length of more or less 20 years, that puts Kazan's date of birth about 140 years prior to Rin's, putting him squarely in the early 19th century, between 1810 and 1830. At first glance, I thought this couldn't be right. Surely the feudal era in Japan ended before then, right? So I decided to do some reading, because I know almost nothing about Japanese history. And as it turns out, I was dead wrong. Feudalism in Japan lasted all the way up until the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Before then, Japanese society was organised by a strict feudal caste system during the Edo period under the Tokugawa shogunate. To give you a quick rundown, Edo society, much like ogres, onions and cake, existed in layers. Specifically, 4 social layers designed to keep political and economic power in the hands of the ruling class of samurai. The 4 classes were the samurai, the ruling class of warriors and feudal lords, who constituted about 10% of the population, and the 3 commoner classes, the peasants, the artisans, and the merchants. The peasants were the highest of these classes, as they were the ones who produced the food that kept the whole system functioning. and the merchants who didn't actually produce any goods of their own were at the bottom. This caste system had been rigid as iron since the 15th century, when the Tokugawa shogunate took power. But as intervention from Western powers forced Japan to open itself up to trade under threat of military action, this caste system began to crumble. Notably, samurai could not earn money or own land. Their wealth was allocated to them as a stipend from their lord, the daimyo, appropriate to their responsibility and hereditary position. The daimyo got his income from the taxes on the commoner classes, creating a stable economy, where the amount of wealth and who owned it was tightly controlled by the daimyo and his samurai. Very little wealth ever left or entered Japan during the years of isolation. But when those years started to end, everything began to change. The samurai weren't trading with these new Western arrivals themselves. They didn't produce anything, they had nothing to give. Instead, the people mostly conducting this new trade with Western merchants were Japanese merchants, the people at the bottom of this social hierarchy. They were receiving income that the shogunate effectively couldn't control, and as individual merchants became wealthier, they started to get more control over the economy and create a middle class of their own. Costs of living went up, dropping the wealth share of the samurai. The poor got richer, the rich got poorer, and the shogunate's policy of isolation was falling apart at the seams. Kazan Yamaoka grew up under this shifting social background. He couldn't deal with the decay of the caste system that had held his family in their position of prestige for 200 years. He was furious that the system wasn't going to be able to maintain the life he was used to, and saw the degeneration of the samurai bloodlines and the social hierarchy to be something to avoid at all costs. And at the time, he was far from the only one. The Sonnō movement was starting to gain traction after American trade agreements showed the shogunate's willingness to kowtow to Western demands. Sonnō translates to revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, and that summarised the movement's goals pretty well. Since the shogunate was proved to be ultimately toothless, Sonnō demanded they be replaced with a new government more capable of defending Japanese interests and enacting the will of the emperor, who at the time was a purely symbolic figurehead while the shogun held the power. Sonnō sparked a rebellion by some southern prefectures as well as ronin, masterless samurai, who assassinated shogunate and western officials and destroyed trading ships. While the term Sonnō is never actually used in Kazan's story, it's clear that Kazan's method and ideologies were in some way shaped by their actions. Kagawa, the prefecture where the Yamaoka family lived, was a region loyal to the shogunate during this time. So it's not surprising that Kazan found himself the only one of his family willing to take a stand against this big social change. The merchants and peasants were getting wealthy, while the samurai class was bleeding money. Kazan wouldn't stand for it, and he felt he and his family were owed better than that. This is just one reason why Kazan's law is so good. Without going on pages of exposition about Japanese history and the political background of the late Edo era, behaviour were able to not just organically weave authentic Japanese history into Kazan's youth, but also capture the socio-political zeitgeist like time in a bottle. They have built the character of Kazan into the world of feudal Japan in a way that completely fits with established history. It's a picture-perfect implementation of the historical domain character. Society, as it had been for 200 years, was collapsing, and the samurai classes were paying the cost as the commoners gained power. But the Yamaoka family didn't share Kazan's hostility to this change. Renjiro, Kazan's father, and a legendary warrior in his own right, tried to dissuade Kazan from taking matters into his own hands. He suggested that Kazan turn his eye to more noble pursuits, but the samurai were a caste defined by battle. They were a warrior class at a time of enforced peace. They turned from knight-like warrior elites to bureaucrats, whose swordsmanship was only truly ceremonial. They still carried the katana and trained with it, but not really for actual warfare, mostly just because it was customary and symbolic. It's implied that Renjiro saw active combat duty in his time, by the description on Splintered Hull, but the implications of noble pursuits, in a time where most of the nobles were bureaucrats and civil servants instead of soldiers, can't have gone down well with Kazan. Being demanded by both his father and society at the time to essentially do nothing, and watch the world he knew crumble was unthinkable to Kazan. Clearly, being settled into a domestic and peaceful family life didn't suit him. Even setting aside his quarrel with his father, the flavor text on Cracked Sakazuki implies a difficult marriage that may or may not have resulted in Kazan abusing his wife. But that's not to say he didn't care for his family. He did, but in the most detached way possible. He seemed to care more for the idea of his family than he did for the actual people in his family, which fits in with his traditionalist and puritanical outlook. The overwhelming sense of pride he took in the Yamaoka family banner, the Sashimono, and his furious response at being called Oni Yamaoka, a disgrace to his family, is testament to Kazan's pride in the Yamaoka bloodline, despite his rocky relationship with his actual relatives. This is shown most clearly in his relationship with his son Akito, who would eventually go on to sire a family line that resulted in the birth of Rin Yamaoka in the late 20th century. Akito isn't even mentioned in Kazan's main bio. You might not even have known he existed until now. But the Oni's add-ons illustrate a small part of Kazan's life, where he lived not as a brutal samurai warrior, but as a father looking to continue his legacy. Akito's story is simple. Kazan was training him as a swordsman from a young age, but after his leg was injured falling from a tree, Kazan was inconsolable. After taking out his rage on the family of Akito's playmate, he trekked to a mountain temple time and time again to try to heal his son, losing a toenail in the freezing cold for it. But Akito would never fight again. His wound would never heal, and as such we never hear about him in Kazan's story. Despite all this sacrifice, Kazan's actual emotional investment in his son's well-being, beyond his scuppered future as a warrior, seems negligible at best. He is more devoted to the idea of Akito succeeding him and continuing the Yamaoka bloodline than he is to Akito himself. To Kazan, family was not a group of people you necessarily loved or cared about, but a responsibility. To let your family down and disrespect those who came before you was an indictment of your own honour. This is just as much of an explanation for his rampage across Japan as the social conditions of the time. Seeing the lower orders masquerading as samurai was an insult to the true samurai bloodlines, to the Yamaoka family. Kazan would not allow this insult to go unpunished, so he took up his father's blade and started a bloody campaign of vengeance to stamp out the upstart lower classes and give a morbid purpose to Kazan's life as a soldier. This is a wonderful way to establish your character in their setting. Kazan had principles of family, honour, and the glory of warfare that he sought to maintain in a world where those things meant almost nothing, and meant less every day. The slaughter he went on as he rampaged throughout Japan both establishes him as a bloodthirsty and skilled enough soldier to excel as a killer in the entity's service, but is also an entirely natural, if completely unhinged, response to the social and economic conditions of late Edo-era Japan. This is what I was talking about when I said the Oni's contact is what elevates his law above the rest. Kazan Yamaoka feels grown out of the world he came from, a natural product of it that could only have come from that place, from that period in time, from that social position. Only a Japanese samurai, from a family at the brink of destitution at the hands of a shifting social ladder, would have reacted in exactly the way Kazan did, and only Kazan would have gone on to do what he did next. He rolled across Japan like a thunderstorm, putting farmers and warriors alike to the sword. He was a terror of the villages, the bogeyman that scared grown men into sleepless nights, clutching their families to them, as if they could protect them from his wrath. Here's where his skin bios start to tell the gruesome tales of Kazan Yamaoka's crusade. His brutality and violence was such that many people feared him as a literal Oni, a force of demonic power that no man could face in battle. He would take grisly trophies to boast of his success, from top knots taken from samurai he felt unfit to wield the title, to a severed face, taken from a wealthy merchant and strapped to the handle of his blade. Kazan would even use the Oni persona to his advantage, to infiltrate the homes of unsuspecting victims during the Japanese festival of Namahage, where actors dressed in Oni masks visit the children of the Oga Peninsula in northern Japan every year, to admonish them for naughty behaviour and keep them from misbehaving. Kazan would wear this disguise to enter the homes of these children and their families, but it wasn't the children he was after. I think Kazan Yamaoka subconsciously always knew who he was, what kind of man he would grow up to be. At least, that's what I got from the description of the wooden Oni mask add-on for his power. He was drawn to the Oni mask as a child, despite it giving him nightmares. He hated being referred to as Oni Yamaoka, despite wielding a kanabo, the heavy two-handed club traditionally associated with the mythical Oni due to their great strength. When I was thinking about this, I was wondering, why would Kazan associate himself so closely with the monster he despises? But what I should have asked is, why does he despise it so much, if he didn't somehow identify with it? What I'm trying to say is, Kazan might have hated being called Oni Yamaoka because he ultimately knew it was true, deep down somewhere. He believed his cause was pure and just, but a just cause doesn't mean the path he took to completing it wasn't a dark, dark path indeed. Kazan broke the codes and oaths he had sworn to enact his bloody punishment on the people of Japan. Someone as obsessed with family and honour as him had to have understood that on some level. His story says the insult of Oni Yamaoka confused him, and I fully believe he didn't consciously understand it at first, but the reason it angered him so greatly, despite apparently making sense to him, is because subconsciously, he knew that the lord that was mocking him was right. But as to when his conscious mind caught up, to see that we need to move on a little further, to the apex of Kazan's crusade of murder and violence. He was preparing to pay a little visit to the lord who had dubbed him Oni Yamaoka, when a samurai crossed his path and attacked him. He had Kazan on the back foot, but he hesitated before delivering the killing blow, allowing Kazan to lash out and crush his skull with his kanabo. As the samurai bled to death by the side of the road, Kazan recognized his own father, Renjiro, in front of him. What a perfect image to show Kazan's cursed legacy of bloodshed, tragedy, and pain. The demon of the Yamaoka bloodline, howling at the deathbed of the father he had disgraced and killed, so absorbed in his own self-righteousness, his own self-inflicted misery. He allowed his father's armour to be stolen by thieves. The last relic of the legendary Renjiro, the last true samurai of the Yamaoka bloodline, scavenged and lost. It was fate spitting in Kazan's face for all he'd done, all the blood he'd shed. And as he wandered through the forest, a subconscious idea that he was the Oni Yamaoka started to bubble to the surface. Kazan heard Renjiro's voice berating him for what he'd done, reprimanding him for every failure, every broken oath, his own doubts mirrored in his father's words. He found himself at the foot of a grinning Oni statue in the forest, and Kazan had to reckon with a grim realization. Maybe he was the Oni Yamaoka, the ogre, the bogeyman who frightened children at night and had grown men bar their doors and hide, the noble impostor, the samurai without honour. Kazan heard the voices in his head accusing him of being everything he hated, and in an act of proud defiance, he pushed the voices out. He would wash his conscience clean in the blood of everyone who slandered his name and that of his family, starting with the lord who had wronged him. Kazan Yamaoka could not be stopped that night. A dozen samurai, shattered by his kanabo, the arrogant noble brutalized, his slanderous tongue ripped out. All who stood in the way of his victory, Kazan had defeated, but he had not considered how the common people of the lord's town would react. Kazan fought viciously and killed many, but the same peasants he had disregarded as impostors overwhelmed him in a mob, slicing and torturing him with whatever implements they had to hand. before leaving him to slowly bleed to death in a humble stone mill. A warrior of his legendary reputation, humbled and defeated by mere peasants. There could have been no greater an insult for a man as proud as Kazan. No more ignoble a death for a man who prided himself on his nobility. This would have been the end of Kazan's story, but for the intervention of the entity. It scooped him from the floor of that stone mill, and reforged him into a body as full of strength as he had in life. But such a lease of life came at a price, a sick joke played by the entity at Kazan's expense. He was reborn as an Oni, the very image of monstrous rage and supernatural power that Kazan hated and feared his whole life. Of course, in isolation of the story, a supernatural Japanese killer being an Oni makes absolute sense even on its own. But in the context of Kazan's life, the Oni becomes a more powerful image than just a demon. It's a reflection of the man Kazan always feared he would become, and yet that his nature always drove him to embrace. A constant reminder of Kazan's failure to uphold his family's honour, and a symbol of the eventual decline of the samurai bloodline. A decline that led to one girl in her family home in Takamatsu almost 200 years later, finishing what Kazan started. Because, as much as Kazan's actions were ultimately pointless in preventing the collapse of the samurai, he was ultimately right to fear it. The Yamaoka family fell into decline, to the point that its patriarch was reduced to grovelling to his boss to care for his ailing wife and support his daughter. When Rin found out what her father had done, by slicing her and her mother up with the same katana wielded by her ancestor Renjiro, she swore revenge, and spilled her father's blood for what he'd done. By bringing the Yamaoka lineage to a swift and brutal end, Rin proved that Kazan was right. Giving up and letting change happen brought ruin to the family once and for all. The shattered bloodline of the Yamaokas was nothing but a footnote in history now, while the entity picked through the pieces. While, yes, Sally Smithson and Adiris are more complicated and interesting characters when you look at them purely outside the context of their surroundings, Kazan's lore paints a bigger and deeper picture of the world around him. Feudal Japan was the perfect setting to tell Kazan's story, a story that was so good and so thematically consistent that it made his descendants' story better simply by existing. The context of a shifting socio-political landscape at the end of the Edo era is an ideal one to birth a furious nobleman trying to hold on to some vestige of reputation, and Kazan's story in turn provides context to Rin's as a conclusion to it 2 centuries in the making. Maybe the nurse and plague stories in the upcoming tomes will do something similar for them, build them more coherently into the worlds they belong to, and take Kazan's crown for their own. I look forward to reading them myself and finding out in due course. But as good or bad as they turn out to be, I will always value the tale of Kazan Yamaoka for what it is. A grim fable that shows what men will do for their own flesh and blood. I just wanted to say a few words before I left it off here. The plague guide that you all voted on is underway. It's being made right now. I'll probably be able to get one more lore video out before then, so I'll see if I can squeeze it out in that time. Now that I have Twitch affiliate, I'm streaming twice a week. I'm streaming on Wednesday and Sunday nights from 7:30 GMT, but I might add other times to that schedule. If you want to join the Discord, then the link to that is in the description. That will give you announcements when a new video goes live and when I'm streaming, so you won't miss a single one if you sign on there. And I just want to say thank you to Demon Riceball on the Discord, a dear friend of mine who provided me with a lot of the information and pronunciation guides I needed to make this video about Japanese history, including the photo of Kagawa that I used when I was talking about that. So thanks to him for that. Right, that's all from me. I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday's stream if you're going to be there, and if not, till the next video. See you around.